The land out past Red Hollow didn't forgive a man. It only kept score. Silas Ward knew that better than most. 36 years old, with shoulders bent like the cottonwoods that grew crooked against the wind, he worked a failing ranch in the dry bones of New Mexico territory. The soil gave him dust, the bank gave him debt, and the past gave him nothing but the smell of smoke he could never quite wash out of his memory. 3 years before, a fire had taken his wife and his boy. Folks in town called it an accident. A kitchen stove, they said. Bad luck, they said. Silas stopped listening to what folks said a long time ago. Now, he lived alone, lean and silent, trusting no one, holding on to the one thing his father left him. A patch of ground that the world seemed determined to take. So when the foreclosure notice came, Silas did a thing he swore he'd never do. He placed an advertisement in the territorial paper. Rancher seeks wife. Must keep house, ask no questions, and want nothing she cannot earn. He did not believe in marriage. He believed in survival. And a ranch worked by two had a better chance than a ranch worked by one broken man. He expected a frightened girl. A widow, maybe. Someone as lost as the land itself. He did not expect what stepped off the evening train. She came down the iron steps slow, dust on her coat, the hem of her dress torn ragged, and eyes gray, level, sharp as a skinning knife, that swept the platform once and counted every man on it before they settled on Silas. "You'd be Mr. Ward," she said. It wasn't a question. "And you'd be Rose Marlowe," he answered. Something flickered behind her eyes. Gone in an instant. "I would," she said. But the woman who called herself Rose did not move like a bride. She moved like a soldier who'd learned to walk into rooms expecting to leave them in a hurry. When the train whistle screamed, every traveler on the platform flinched. She didn't. Her hand only drifted, quiet and easy, toward the shawl wrapped around her waist. Silas had hunted enough to know the shape of a pistol under cloth. He said nothing. He loaded her single trunk onto the wagon and drove them out under a bruised purple sky, and the whole way home, neither of them spoke a word. But Silas was thinking. The letters she'd written him had been soft, gentle hand, looping, careful script. The woman beside him had hands like his own, calloused at the palm, scarred across the knuckles. Hands that had held reins and rope and the cold weight of a gun for a great many years. This woman had not written those letters. So who, Silas wondered, had he just brought home? That first night, the trouble found them fast. Silas was banking the fire when he saw them through the window. 3 riders on the north ridge, black against the last gray light. They did not come closer. They did not call out. They only sat their horses, still as gravestones, and watched the house. Before Silas could reach for the rifle over the door, the woman was already moving. She killed the lamp with 2 fingers. She caught his sleeve and pulled him low to the floor. "Down," she breathed. "Stay below the sill." "You know them?" Silas whispered. "No." Her voice was cold and certain in the dark. "But I know what they're doing. If they only wanted to scare you, they'd have fired into the air by now. A man who shoots wants you afraid. A man who stays silent. He's counting. He's counting how many of us are inside this house." Silas turned and looked at her in the dark, at the steady line of her jaw, at eyes that did not blink. In that moment he understood, all the way down to the marrow, that the woman he'd married off a train was no ordinary bride. The riders left before dawn. They left no tracks they didn't mean to leave. And, by morning, The woman who called herself Rose was already crouched in the yard, reading the hoofprints in the dry earth, like a preacher reading scripture. "Shod horses," she murmured. "Town stock, not range ponies." She looked up at the north ridge with an expression Silas couldn't name, like a woman staring at a place she had already seen in her nightmares. "Mr. Ward," she said softly, "where is the grain stored?" "Why?" "Because if they come back, they'll come with fire, and you've got your whole winter sitting downwind of the barn." She stood and brushed the dust from her knees. "Move it tonight." Silas did. He did not ask how a bride knew the way men burned a ranch. He was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. It broke open a week later, over a kerosene lamp and a stack of old correspondence. Silas laid the marriage letters on the table between them. "Rose," he said, "read me the last line you wrote, the one about the church in El Paso." The woman went very still. "I never wrote about a church," she said quietly. "No," Silas agreed. "You didn't, because you never wrote any of these." He pushed the lamp toward her. "Now, who are you?" For a long moment, the only sound was the wind clawing at the shutters. Then she set both her scarred hands flat on the table. "My name is Elena Marlowe," she said. "Rose was my sister." She drew a slow breath. "Was, or is, I don't know anymore. And that is the only honest thing I've told you since I stepped off that train." The story came out in pieces, the way hard things do. Rose Marlowe, the real bride, had written those letters. Soft hand, gentle words, a woman with hope still left in her. But Rose had also stumbled onto something she was never meant to find. Forged loan papers, forged deeds, a whole valley of ranchers being robbed of their land through ink and lies. Silas Ward's land among them. Rose had bought a ticket to Red Hollow to warn the people being cheated. She never arrived. Somewhere between El Paso and this dusty fork in the world, Rose Marlowe vanished off the face of the earth. "So I took her ticket," Elena said. "I took her name. I took her place in your house." Her gray eyes lifted to his. "Because the men who took my sister are watching everyone who asks questions. But nobody watches a bride. Nobody suspects a woman who comes to a man with a wedding promise." Silas sat in the lamplight a long time. "You lied your way into my home," he said at last. "I did. You might be the law's problem. You might be a killer. I might." She didn't flinch from it. "But I've kept you alive 3 nights running, Silas Ward. And I mean to find out who burned the rest of these families to the ground." She leaned forward. "Including, I think, the family you lost." The lamp guttered, and the past which Silas had buried so carefully began to claw its way up out of the dirt. She found it where the old house had stood. Silas had never gone back to the burned ground. 3 years he'd left it alone, a black scar in the earth he couldn't bear to look at. But Elena knelt in the ash and dug her fingers into the packed soil beneath, and when she lifted them, she held them out to him without a word. Silas leaned close, breathed in. Kerosene. Soaked deep into the earth where no stove fire could ever have put it. "A kitchen stove doesn't pour oil into the foundation," Elena said gently. "Silas, your wife, and your boy. They didn't die by accident. Something broke loose inside him then. 3 years of grief he'd packed down like grave dirt. He turned away so she wouldn't see his face. His voice came out rough as gravel. "Why?" he said. "Why my family? We were nothing. Dirt poor. We had nothing worth killing for." "You had land," Elena said quietly. "And your wife. Maybe your wife saw something. Maybe she knew the same thing Rose knew." She rose and stood beside him, and for the first time, she did not stand like a soldier. She stood like a woman who understood loss. Men like the one we're hunting don't burn what they want. They burn what knows too much. Silas looked out at the long, cruel land, at everything that had been taken from him. "Then we're not just protecting my dirt," he said. "No," said Elena. "We're settling a debt." Sheriff Amos Vale rode out 3 days later, with a paper folded in his coat. He was a heavy, easy-talking man, the kind who smiled while his eyes stayed flat. He tacked the poster to the porch post and tipped his hat like a gentleman. "Wanted, Elena Marlowe, for the murder of a man in El Paso." "Funny thing, Ward," the sheriff drawled. "You send off for a bride named Rose. And what walks into my town is a killer named Elena." He smiled wider. "Whole place is talking. Whole place has turned its back on her already." When he'd gone, Silas turned to Elena, the poster crumpled in his fist. "Did you?" he asked. "Did you kill a man in El Paso?" She did not look away. "I shot him," she said. "I won't pretend I didn't, but I have never in my life killed an innocent man." Her voice dropped low and hard. "He was the last man to see my sister alive, and he laughed when I asked him where she was. So I made him stop laughing." Silas stood at the crossroads of his whole life. A piece of paper that said one thing: a woman who had lied to him from the first breath, and saved his life 3 times since. He tore the poster down the middle. "Show me where to look," he said. She took him to a ruined house near the canyon mouth, a place gone to owls and dust. And there, in the wreckage of a back room, Elena found it. A music box, scorched black on one side, its little brass key half melted by some long-dead fire. Inside, folded small and yellowed, was half a sheet of paper. A list of names: ranchers, families, every one of them robbed of their land through forged deeds. The paper was torn clean down the middle. Half the names were missing. Elena stared at it a long moment. Then she looked up at Silas, and something in her face had gone pale. "This is Rose's hand," she whispered. "She hid it here before they took her." Her finger traced the torn edge. "But it's only half. Silas, where would your wife have hidden something she wanted no man to find?" And Silas, very slowly, looked back across the dark miles toward his own ranch. Toward a loose floorboard beneath the bed he hadn't slept in for 3 years. The death of his wife. The vanishing of Rose. The stolen land. One single thread, running through all of it. And the man holding the other end was a banker named Gideon Rusk. They moved against the clock. A federal judge was coming to Red Hollow. 2 halves of a torn list, joined together, sworn before a court of law. And Gideon Rusk's whole empire of forged paper would burn to nothing. Gideon knew it. And Gideon did not wait for the law. The night before the judge arrived, the riders came back. But this time they came with torches. Silas smelled the smoke before he saw it. By the time he reached the yard, the barn was already a wall of fire, roaring up into the black sky, and the cattle inside were screaming. "The papers!" Elena shouted over the roar. "Get the papers! I'll get the stock!" But Silas was already running into the flames. He went for the horses, for the living things trapped behind a wall of fire. Because 3 years ago, he had failed to save the living things he loved, and he would be damned if he stood outside and listened to it happen twice. A beam came down behind him. The doorway folded in a shower of sparks. And just like that, Silas Ward was trapped inside the burning barn. Outside, Elena stood frozen with the evidence box clutched against her chest. Here it was. The choice. Run. Carry the proof to the judge. Clear her sister's name. Finish the thing she had crossed 300 miles of hell to finish. Or turn back into the fire for a man who was not truly her husband and lose everything. For one heartbeat, she did not move. Then, Elena Marlowe dropped the box in the dirt and ran straight into the flames. She found him pinned, half-conscious, one arm caught beneath the fallen beam. She put her shoulder under it and lifted with everything she had, screaming against the weight, and dragged him out into the cold night air as the roof came down behind them in a hurricane of sparks. They lay together in the dirt, coughing, blackened, alive. The barn collapsed. And the evidence box. Rose's half, the music box list, all of it, caught a stray ember and burned to ash before their eyes. Silas stared at it, hollow. "It's gone," he rasped. "Everything. It's all gone." But Elena was already reaching to her collar, to a small square of cloth she had kept sewn shut against her heart since the first night she stepped off that train. She tore the stitches with her teeth, and from inside she drew a single folded paper, untouched by the fire. The last copy, the whole list, complete, hidden by Rose, carried by Elena. Across every mile, through every lie, waiting for this exact and terrible night. "No," Elena said. Her voice shook, but her eyes were bright as struck flint. "It isn't gone. It was never in the box, Silas. It was always with me." By morning, the whole town had gathered before Gideon Rusk's bank. Elena climbed the scorched wooden steps. Soot still streaked across her face, and held the paper out to the federal judge for all of Red Hollow to see. The forged deeds, the stolen names, the whole rotten architecture of theft and fire and murder laid bare in the morning light. Gideon Rusk's smile finally died. His hand dropped toward the pistol at his hip, but Silas Ward stepped in front of Elena before the gun cleared leather. For the first time in 3 long years, Silas did not stand alone for the sake of a patch of dirt. He stood for a person. He stood for her, and Elena was no longer fighting alone for a lost sister. She fought for the truth, for Rose, for Silas's murdered wife and boy, and for every poor family in that valley who'd been burned out and buried and told to call it bad luck. It was old Jonah Pike, the half-deaf old man who sold coffee and tobacco at the depot, the one everyone took for a fool, who spoke first. "I saw it," he said, loud and clear, every trace of the doddering fool gone from his voice. "I saw Sheriff Vale hand the Marlowe girl over to Rusk's men. The night she vanished. God forgive me. I stayed quiet too long." And then another voice rose. And another. All the slent, frightened people of Red Hollow, finding their courage at last, stepping forward one by one to bear witness. Gideon Rusk was taken in chains. Sheriff Amos Vale's treachery was laid bare before the court. The land came home to the families it had been stolen from, and the fate of Rose Marlowe, when at last it was known, was a grief Elena would carry all her days. But she carried it now in the daylight, not alone in the dark. When it was over, Elena meant to leave. The marriage had been a lie after all. A name borrowed from a dead woman's letters. She had no claim here. She packed her trunk and stood in the doorway of the rebuilt house, ready to ride out the way she had come. Silas did not stop her with soft words. He was not a man who knew how to say the tender things. Instead, he walked out to the half-burned gate of the ranch. He set a new board across it, and he nailed up a fresh sign, the letters carved by his own hand. Elena stared at it a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was not quite steady. "You're certain," she said, "that you want to put my name on the only thing you've got left in this world?" And Silas Ward looked at her, at the woman who had lied her way into his home and saved his life and walked into fire to pull him out of it. "No," he said. "I'm not putting your name on the last thing I have." A slow breath. "I'm putting it on the first thing I want to build again." For a long time, Elena said nothing. She did not say that she loved him. She was not that kind of woman, and it was not that kind of love. She only unbuckled the gun belt from her waist, the pistol she had slept beside every night since El Paso, and she set it down, gently beside the door. Then she stepped inside the house, and out past Red Hollow, where the land had never once forgiven a man. Two people, who had nothing left to lose, began, together, to build.